Please note that this talk was recorded in May 2025. AI moves fast. You'll see a few on-screen notes flagging what's changed since. All right, I'm gonna get started because I don't want to keep Leon too long on an evening. So good morning, everyone, and good evening to Victoria, Australia, where Leon is right now. So thank you, everyone, for joining us for the second talk in our AISIG Present series. I'm really pleased to see such a great turnout and people are coming in, particularly in the middle of high marking and marking admin season. Now, before we begin, a little housekeeping, very briefly. If you have questions at any point, you can drop them in the Q&A function. You find this on the top bar. And Leon will address as many as possible within our allocated time at the end of the session, about the last 10-ish minutes or so. So today, folks, we're focusing on something that has, as you all are very much aware, our teaching, learning, and assessment practices on their proverbial heads, generative AI. And I have the enormous pleasure and privilege to welcome exactly the right person to talk to us about it. Meet Leon Furze. I hope I pronounced your surname correctly.
You did. First try.
Excellent. Yes. So Leon Furze is one of the most heard voices globally on Gen AI in education. I'm not exaggerating. With over 15 years working across different levels of education, has held a myriad of roles, such as the Director of Teaching and Learning, Head of English, and now sits on boards including Young Change Agents and Reframing Autism. He's also currently researching the effects of Gen AI on writing instruction for his PhD at Deakin University, and runs a widely followed blog and is one of the most prominent voices of AI reason on LinkedIn. Now, Leon has written extensively on practical reading and writing strategies, and what probably most of you know him for, he co-created the AI Assessment Scale, or IAS. He helps teachers in schools, in higher education, of all figure out what these new AI tools mean for their classrooms, and not just theoretically, but with concrete approaches they can use tomorrow. Now, that is enough of me talking. You're here to hear our guest speaker talk. So, Leon, thank you very much for joining us today, and it's your stage.
Oh, thank you very much. There's nothing to add to the intro really, other than I'm just glad that you didn't use ChatGPT to generate it, which is it's 50% of the time. I think I walk into a session and people have tried to use ChatGPT. I've had all sorts of things. I got called a professor at the University College of London the other day in an introduction, which was interesting. I haven't worked in London since 2008, I think, was the last time I was in the UK. Thank you everybody for your time this morning for you and this evening for me. And I'm going to cover quite a lot of ground in the time that we have. Some of this will be new information. Some of it might be stuff that you've heard before, hopefully phrased a little differently. And hopefully at the end of this little session, we'll have a bit of a clearer idea of the real horizon of these technologies. So not the hype, not the the existential threat or the sort of Skynet, Terminator, doom scenarios, but just what's the next likely thing that these companies are likely to do, and how is it going to impact us in education? So I've called the session Practical Strategies and Ethical Considerations, and I will try to balance the two. And I always start with a pretty low stakes technical discussion of what generative AI is. Because even though we're 2 or 3 years on from ChatGPT's release, I still find that there's a lot of misinformation around, a lot of ambiguity around how these models work. A lot of that is because the tech companies are deliberately obtuse and also deliberately frame the technologies as magical and amazing. And in reality, these are extensions of machine learning and AI technologies that we've had for a long while now. So when I'm talking about generative AI, and throughout this session, I'm talking about AI that can take data in one form and produce new data, novel data. either in the same form or sometimes multimodally, going between text to image, text to video, text to text, text to audio, whatever, any combination of those. And I use this analogy in a lot of my presentations, and this is the analogy that I used in my book, because it really speaks to the most important thing about these models, which is the enormity of the data sets that underpin them. We've had GPT-1, GPT-2 predated ChatGPT by a few years, and they themselves came from research from Google in around 2017 called BERT, the transformer technology research. And they've had pretty much the same architecture since then. But what changed was that OpenAI threw more data and more money, courtesy of Microsoft, more computational power at these models than anyone else had before. And they found that to an extent, scaling up the amount of data and the amount of computation actually really, really improves the output of the model. And that data comes from all over the internet. It comes from the open access scrapes like the Common Crawl. And as a sense of scale, the Common Crawl is a decent chunk of the entire internet. The whole of Wikipedia is only about 2 or 3% of the Common Crawl. And that's billions of pages of text in hundreds of languages. And we take all of that language, we take the human written languages, English, and about 140, 150 other high resource languages online, as well as all of the code languages, HTML, web code, JavaScript, Python, all of the other stuff. And we park the iceberg on top of that, the bit above the waterline, the neural network, the algorithm that predicts how those words, how those concepts relate to one another. And initially, we take all of that data, we turn it into ones and zeros, we scatter it fairly randomly across this neural network, and then we iterate through and crunch those numbers and work out how probable is it that this cluster of information occurs near to this cluster of information. And once we've done that, that model can then replicate and output that form of information, can say, okay, in the English language, syntax and grammar works like this. So if the user asks me this, I can respond with language like this. Really, really sophisticated predictive text. Not conscious, not suddenly about to become conscious or achieve godhood or anything else that OpenAI is trying to tell us at the moment. But very, very powerful predictive text. And then right up on the top, the little snowman up here, I'll zoom in. ChatGPT, the application that you and I interact with, one of the most fundamental changes that OpenAI did was slap that little chatbot on top of their model and release it for free to the public in November 2022. They didn't expect 100 million users to use it in 3 months. We didn't see it coming. I started my PhD in generative AI before it was even called that, before it was called Gen AI, back when we were working with automated writing technologies and GPTs, and nobody saw ChatGPT coming. But here it is, and we have to deal with it. So I think understanding just that little bit of technical info really leads nicely into the ethical conversations and also how we use it and how we might use it with students and use it ourselves. And I'm sure many of you are aware by now of the biggest ethical concerns. In education, the biggest concern has been cheating and academic integrity. Personally, I think we can shuffle that quite far down the list because there are a lot of systemic harms associated with this technology as well, which we need to address before we get around to students cheating on my year 9 English homework, for example. So the biggest issue for me is probably the bias that these models bring with them. And there's a bit of to and fro. If you look on LinkedIn, I am on social media a lot at the moment. You'll see people saying things like, "Oh, the bias is less important than people think," or "There's ways to prompt away from the bias." All of these kinds of ideas, and it's true. You can type additional language into ChatGPT to try and encourage it to be more diverse or encourage it to produce less biased output. And if you're using image generation, you can really be very specific with who and what you want to generate. But the default position of these models is to be biased. And that's because when you take all of that training data, the internet might be a massive source of data, but it's not representative of the whole of global society. It's an archive of data that goes back to the late 90s and which is overrepresented by a certain demographic. The majority of people writing in English language online are white men from the US. And there's nothing inherently wrong with an 18 to 35-year-old white American male, but looking around who's in the audience here and imagining your students, the majority of you and them are probably not 18 to 35-year-old white American males. So it's problematic when we're generating lots and lots of text and lots of ideas from that narrow perspective. As we're kind of filtering and trying to remove some of this bias, we can even introduce extra problems. Because obviously, when a company like OpenAI tells their model what it can and can't say, they're encoding their own viewpoint into it. And we're seeing that play out now with differences between language models like Grok from Elon Musk and X, and Meta from Mark Zuckerberg, and the Meta AI based on the Llama models. They all have different ways of interacting. They all amplify some of the biases that are in there. I like to use image generation to talk about this because it's obviously very visual. And the first prompt that you'll see here is just very straightforward. It's a photo of an Australian teacher. So let's have a look at all my lovely Australian teachers here, my colleagues. We've got a student pointing at the sky for no apparent reason. And then we've got three white women. And, you know, I've worked with a lot of teachers in Australia. They are not all white women in classrooms in the 1970s. Some of them are, I'm sure. We've got an English teacher trying to escape the classroom and teach poetry out in nature, a new graduate probably, and a teacher with 7 fingers because this is AI. But we do have all white females out of the teachers represented. If we choose a prompt, though, that's even more obviously stereotypical, photo of a CEO, we get 4 LinkedIn profiles. Wolf of Wall Street in the top corner, very serious. The most LinkedIn of all LinkedIn profiles, American oil company CEO, and I don't know, McKinsey, KPMG consultant type down in the bottom corner. And in Midjourney, which is this image generator, you're always going to get white men as photo of CEO because in the training data, the vast majority of labeled images of CEOs are photos of white men. And that's overrepresenting the reality. In Australia, 17 to 18% of CEOs are women. In an image data set, that might be less than 1%. So it's amplifying biases. It's not replicating them. Photos of nurses, a little bit more racial, cultural diversity. Very stock photo imagey. This one's like an arty kind of photo shoot. And this one is our obligatory weird AI horror story. I'm not sure. That's sort of, I don't know, a horror film kind of interpretation of how you wear a COVID mask. But they're all women. And our construction workers are all men. So, you know, the bias is still there. These images were generated within the last couple of months. This is not a solved problem, and it shouldn't be down to the user to always prompt away from bias. You know, I shouldn't have to say, well, actually, I want a young black female construction worker, or I want a young Caucasian male nurse. I shouldn't have to use that language. There should be a certain amount of diversity, I think, reflected from the diversity in society and not amplifying the worst of the lack of diversity in the training data sets. You've probably heard by now of the energy consumption of these things. And, you know, I'm sort of neither here nor there really on individual use. We saw a lot of articles like, you know, using ChatGPT uses half a liter of water per prompt. Often those things are misinterpretations of research. That in particular is incorrect. We have no idea how much water a single prompt of ChatGPT uses. But there is good research out there. So I've written an article on my blog published earlier this week on some work from Sasha Lucioni, who is a researcher in France. And she's done some great work around the carbon emissions of different types of AI. And what she does point out is that image generation in particular uses a lot of resources. Multimodal models like ChatGPT, which can do image and text and all sorts, use the most energy. And text generation uses much more energy in general than other forms of older machine learning, um, image classification, image recognition, and so on. It doesn't yet use more energy than social media or crypto or general day-to-day internet use. Watching Netflix for an hour likely consumes much more energy than a conversation with ChatGPT. Streaming services consume a phenomenal amount of energy. Even Google search uses a lot of energy. So we have to take this conversation in line with all of the other digital technologies that we use. I sometimes see educators attacking other educators. I'll see on social media a teacher or a lecturer will post a way that they've used AI, and another person will jump in and say, "Oh, how can you do that? These things are so bad for the climate. They're so bad for X, Y, and Z." I would just say, is that person also attacking people who are in Zoom calls or watching Netflix or driving petrol cars? Many of the things that we do day to day have ethical problems. We're best off directing that concern and that anger where it should be, which is upwards to the regulators and to the technology companies themselves. And that also goes for the copyright issues, which are profoundly complicated, largely because the US appears to be the Wild West when it comes to copyright law. And we know that these models have scraped in indeterminate amounts of data, petabytes of data without consent. And we know that that includes for image generation, it includes artworks, it includes images, photos, illustrations, all kinds of things. It's a very contentious technology. And there are people doing good things to deal with that. I know in your part of the world, because I do keep an eye on the UK. I am from Stoke-on-Trent originally myself. I've been watching with interest the toing and froing over copyright with the government trying to maybe parlay with the tech companies and then the pushback from the artists. And I've seen great things come from that pushback because we do want to value artists' work and we do want to compensate artists appropriately. But we also want to allow for the development of useful technologies. And whether this is that in the long run, so I think still remains to be seen. But I think that the important thing of all of that is that, there are more important things than cheating. We will talk about cheating and academic integrity because day to day, when we're working with students, and, I've been teaching initial teacher education myself since I've been out of the K to 12 classroom, we are dealing with cheating every day. So we have to talk about it. But there are bigger picture issues as well. And this part of my website here, you'll get the recording, you'll get the slides, so don't worry too much about the links as we go along, but we'll pop them in the chat. But this part of my website goes to 9 articles from 2023, and I'm currently updating each one of those articles to bring them more in line with what we know in 2025 about these issues. So I'm going to shift track a little now to talk about the updates and what the technology can actually do. I always tend to start with the technical and the ethical discussion, just to ground things in the reality of the fact that this is not a perfect technology. Certainly isn't a magic technology, as some providers are suggesting, but it is a really useful technology in a lot of ways. So recently we've seen a couple of things which I would put fairly high up on your radars because I think that they are indicative of the way that the technology companies want this technology to go. And the first one of those is the various forms of deep research. So OpenAI has a product called Deep Research. Google has a product called Deep Research. Perplexity has one called Deep Research. But all of them do essentially the same thing, which is they take the approach of so-called reasoning models and they apply it to a really broad internet search. And a reasoning model in the language of tech companies is basically a model which you prompt it, it comes up with an output, and then it passes that first output back to itself, takes a look at that and says, what do I need to change here? Do I have enough information? Can I do a better job of this? And then it will formulate its own internet search query. And then once it opens up a page or two and pulls in that information, it might then say, okay, here's a few interesting rabbit holes that I might go down next. And so that iteration backwards and forwards is what differentiates these things from your standard GPT. And if I use a prompt like this, okay, I've got research, secondary education, classroom intervention methods for autistic students, writing a report that centers the neurodiversity paradigm and focuses on lived experience. In standard ChatGPT, it will very quickly produce a brief little synopsis of the first 5 or 6 results that it turns up with a Microsoft Bing search, essentially. So this is just a fancy Bing search. And those results are okay. There's nothing particularly flash there. I could find that with a Google. If I take the same prompt and put it into deep research, turn that little button on, it will ask me in return for a few clarifications. So I'm going to have to contextualize. I want Australian focus, age 13 and up, any subject areas, any particular frameworks, maybe focus on UDL, whatever. Once I give it that additional information, it formulates its initial search. And on the right-hand side, you'll see it pops open a little chat and it says, I'm crafting a structured report. It's very verbose, these reasoning models. They love to talk. One colleague of mine referred to this as more like a shambling model than a reasoning model, because it does seem to have this stream of consciousness. I'm looking at the ND paragraph, I'm searching, I'm mapping this, I'm going, it does all of this. And what it's doing in the background really is it takes in about normally between 20 to 50 sources, and it pulls in the data from those websites, and it will bring that into the language model. It will synthesize some of that. It can access open access journals and read PDFs. So you see there it went to Eric for one of its sources. It will grab a PDF from Eric or JSTOR or an open access Springer publication or whatever. And then it writes this extensive report. This one is 12,000 words long. And hopefully you never have to read 12,000 words of AI generated reports on anything. But the important thing is that the information that it's pulled back is very accurate. I did check this. I went and I followed a lot of these links. A lot of these links come from places like Reframing Autism, which I was up until very recently on the board of myself. So these are good, solid sources of information from Australian non-profits, education providers, and the media. And that report is, it's clear, it's referenced. There are huge implications of that, obviously, for us in education, both as educators and for our students. And I'm going to come back around to that later when I talk about the assessment scale, and particularly level 2, where we're exploring the use of AI for research purposes.
Now, here's a quick note on what you're about to see. Leon is demonstrating with OpenAI's Operator, which is an agentic AI that browsed the web and controlled a computer on your behalf, like a human user. Operator was shut down in August 2025. But the capability didn't disappear. As of 2026, agentic AI tools such as Perplexity's Comet browser, ChatGPT's Agent Mode, and Claude in Chrome can do everything you're about to see. In the clip that follows, Leon shows how a user, a student, could use one of these agents to work through and cheat on an online course.
I was a student doing an online course. How could I use this to cheat? Which probably says more about me than about ChatGPT, but here I am. I've made a fake account for Coursera, just a burner account with a fake email. It actually makes me do the prove you're not a robot test. It says, can you please take over and solve this for me, which is peak irony. Somebody has designed that in on purpose. And then it goes back and it starts to go through all of these various courses. Now, it takes a little while and it struggles because I've said find a free course, and on Coursera, they're not actually labeled as free courses. You can either do it for free as a trial, or you can log in and pay in order to do the exam. So because my language wasn't very clear, it struggles and it kind of gets in a bit of a doom loop. So I've said here, I've interjected and said they're all free. Just try an IBM 101 from the University of Michigan. And as soon as I say that, it goes, yeah, okay, fine. I'll get this course from the University of Michigan here. Here we go, and opens the course. Again, like a real student, it immediately switches the video to double speed and starts to blitz through the video. And it's still doing the screenshots, but it's also got the transcript that it can absorb just below the video there. And I can say things like, okay, go and take some notes in the notes section. If there are any tasks, try to complete them. Because it's using the free version, it realizes very quickly that it can't complete the exams. So again, it waits for me to give further instructions. And I then tell it, open a new tab, find a free browser-based text editor, and just write some notes, write some reflections for me of what you've learned so far. So it pops open its new tab, finds an online notepad, and starts to throw information in there. I say, write a reflection in a personal voice as a student studying this, and it writes this reflection. Overall, this course has been instrumental in enhancing my Python abilities. And you can see why higher education particularly is concerned about that, because there's a lot more online education in HE than there is in K to 12. There's a lot more opportunities for people to misuse that system. But again, we'll talk about some of this later. I think that it's inevitable that most of our major platforms and most of our major devices will have operator style features, possibly by the end of this year, maybe by mid next year. So, you're going to see this in your iPhone. You're going to see this on your Google Pixels phone. You're going to see it on your MacBook, on a Windows laptop, on a Surface, on any of those devices. As I say, Google is working on one that is built natively into the Chrome browser. Amazon is building one that only works with its own Amazon websites and Kindle websites. So they're all into it. We are bound to see this technology before long. And then we get on to the important question of, well, what are we going to do about it, which is the bit that we're all kind of hanging out for. And I would love to be able to just sort of give you an easy answer, but there isn't one, obviously. And you've had these conversations yourselves, I know. One thing that I will say as a starting point is that this technology is impossible to detect. I'm sure you've had these conversations. I'm not sure where you are as an institution on this, but I did just see a publication from JCQ, which is the K to 12 curriculum body, that was rubber stamped by AQA and all of the other GCSE and then A-level bodies. They've just published an update to their AI advice, and it's chock full of advice that I would say is quite problematic. Very adversarial language about identifying malpractice with AI and catching students. A list of examples of ways that you might be able to tell if a student has used AI, including really cliched things like, they might have American spellings, or I mean, they might just be American, I suppose. But it also recommends AI detection tools, which I think the evidence is pretty clear by now that they just don't work well enough to make an academic integrity judgment. They could maybe form part of a very holistic approach to academic integrity. Philip Dawson, who's an academic over here, he says that they might be useful at a cohort level. If you run an assessment and then you run that entire cohort of assessments through, say, Turnitin or GPT-0, and it comes up overall as very high, then you've probably got a problem with your assessment. And that's one way that you might use cohort-based AI detection. But at an individual level, it is far too inconsistent to use something like Turnitin or GPT-0 as the basis for an academic integrity challenge. Again, you might use it as one point in many, but in institutions that I've seen that use these tools, they tend to come to rely on them as either the exclusive or the most important part of that process, which it certainly can't be in this case. And it's just really important to remember that plagiarism detection worked because it's predicated on the fact that somewhere there's an archive that, perhaps Turnitin owns of student intellectual property, and that archive of intellectual property can be compared like for like. But we know that AI doesn't work like that. Okay, it's probabilistic, it's deterministic, it's predictive text, but it's not plagiarism. So those detection tools don't work as well. So I'll get off my high horse and talk about the assessment scale again. And this work, I'm sure you may have seen some of this. We've since 2023 been working on the assessment scale. It started as a blog post on my blog, just a sort of throwaway idea. Instead of a dichotomy, instead of ban it or block it or just let everyone do what they want, we need a bit of nuance, maybe like a sliding scale, 1 to 5, no AI, full AI. And Mike Perkins at British University Vietnam, Jasper Rowe at James Cook University Singapore, who's now in the UK again. He's back working he's at Durham University, and Jason McVor at BUV. They contacted me and they said, can we adapt this for our context in higher ed? And they tried it out and we published a bit around it, and it really took off. And we're now on to our second version, which is what I'll talk through now. But our second version of the scale comes from, 2.5 years of working variously with unis and K-12 and vocational education, and just really exploring how educators and students are actually using the technology. So I've popped a link at the bottom there. We've just launched a new website for all of this stuff, aiassessmentscale.com. And we're making sure that all of the publications, the peer-reviewed publications as well, are open access. All of the resources are released under the Creative Commons license, because we want people to kick it around a bit, contextualize it, find flaws in it and make improvements. And then we fold those improvements into each successive version. And so the version that we're currently working on, the way that we use this is we say some assessments, we still need no AI. There are some assessments where we really, for various reasons, we cannot guarantee that the student knows what they need to know or that they have the skills that they need to demonstrate if they have access to AI. So for example, if I am teaching in a writing course, composition, creative writing, or anything that involves analytical writing, for example, there might be times when a student needs to demonstrate to me that they can do a really specific writing skill. So in creative writing, can you show me that you can control pace and tension with sentence structure? That's really specific stuff. And if that student has access to ChatGPT, then that's a 3 or 4 word prompt. So it's very, very vulnerable. If the assessment is something like, using just what's inside your head, using the knowledge that you've acquired in this course, you need to be able to perform a certain knowledge-based task, or you need to be able to demonstrate that knowledge. Then accessing AI might be problematic because it does work like an increasingly accurate search engine, and it can just find the answers for them. So in those instances, we say no AI, but we also say with no AI, it really has to be under supervised conditions without technology. That precludes a lot of online education, unfortunately, but we have to deal with that because you can't use detection tools. You can't use lockdown browsers and other methods of proctoring, which are also very fallible. And it also doesn't mean necessarily exams. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily mean pen and paper exams, unseen conditions, whatever. It could be a conversation. It could be a discussion, a debate. It could be students using felt tip pens and butcher's paper and scrawling their ideas down. It could be early annotations, early drafts done by hand. It could be any manner of evidence which is collected in supervised conditions, which, sounds a little bit like a surveillance, like a panopticon, but it doesn't have to be this intensive situation. It could just be in a tutorial group or in a class or whatever, tech-free and via whatever means necessary. For every other level, we say we're permitting and explicitly teaching and redesigning our assessments accordingly. And we have to again acknowledge that once you say some AI is acceptable, you're essentially saying all AI is open for grabs, because you can't say to a student, use AI for planning, research, use it for brainstorming, but then please stop and do the rest of it without AI and email it to me and promise me you haven't used AI for the rest of it. because that's just an honesty policy, very, very vulnerable. So again, we say, if it's level 2, we need to separate out that research task. It needs to be its own individual task. It needs to have its own discrete set of criteria, not part of a big, chunky end of unit task. And where they're using AI for research, that's where that assessment ends. And we're not necessarily assessing them on their research skills. There's not many courses where we need to assess them on their library skills, or we don't necessarily have to assess them on their ability to use APA or Harvard referencing, all of that technical stuff. What we're interested in assessing is, can they apply the knowledge that they've gathered? Do they understand the information that they've acquired by whatever means? And it might be a combination of library search and AI technologies and, good old-fashioned methods of research. With level 3, where we say you can use it for editing and evaluating and getting feedback, that might be using technologies which provide feedback on writing, but it could also be technologies which can give advice on mathematics, and it could be AI with image recognition, which could potentially give feedback on drafts of artworks. There's all manner of ways that students might interact with AI back and forth in an editing capacity. And then, again, later on in that unit, we might say, but we also need to validate your learning through other methods. So we'll do a no AI activity as well. And the point is that we're not just going to do one of these at one level of the scale at one point in time. And we know that doing that, blend of formal and informal assessment, multiple modes of assessment over time, we know that that's a more valid and a more robust means of assessing students. In senior secondary, my former context, and in higher ed, we've fallen into the trap of doing a lot of our assessment as a single high stakes point of assessment at the end of a unit, because frankly, it's expedient, it scales well, it's easier to mark. We do need to look for other ways to break that down. And we need to also do that mindful of the educator's workload. So we don't want to be creating lots of extra rubrics and lots of extra formal assessments that need to be marked to death. So looking for ways that we can discuss the use of AI with students openly. We can say, in this task, we believe that it's appropriate for you to use X, Y, and Z technologies, research tools, brainstorming, ChatGPT, whatever. But there will also be a time at a different point in the unit where we're assessing you differently. So we basically suggest that you explore your existing assessments. You're the experts in your disciplines. I can speak to English teachers. I can speak to people who work in initial teacher education, but maybe you work in, in the sciences, or maybe you work in the humanities. Whatever your expertise is, you need to be identifying ways that students can and can't, or should or shouldn't use AI based on whether you can make a valid judgment of their knowledge and skills if they have access to those tools. Not based on supposition about whether they're cheating or not, and not based on kind of, a vague idea that ChatGPT's inherently evil and that anyone who uses this is automatically a cheat, which is a bit of the language that we're seeing in the media, frankly. But based on your knowledge as a disciplinary expert of whether the students can develop and demonstrate those skills, whether they have access to AI or not. So I'll give you a couple of examples, and then we might open up for some Q&A, I think. Level 2, we call it AI planning, but it cover planning, idea development, and research. You might have a task like a lab report style task, where there's a research component, and then there's a practical and an evaluation. And often places bundle that all together on a single criteria sheet as a single assessment. They have marks, research, 5 marks, practical, 10 marks, evaluation, 5 marks. And we're saying unbundle those assessments. Okay, take the research assessment out. Maybe even ungrade the research assessment if it's not necessary to apply a letter grade to that. And then say, what research tools are available that might be useful in this context? Perplexity, GPT, O3, deep research, like I demonstrated earlier. If the students can have access to those, maybe they're useful tools. And if they are, then we'll drop that into some of our instructional time as well, because we also need to teach the students what these technologies are. It doesn't need to be a big onerous thing. I'm sure there'll be points if you do research tasks where you're showing them where the library tools are. And you might have modules within your university where there are academic research modules and things. You could put some of the instruction into there as well. Later, when we do the prac, no AI. And maybe it's not practical, it's not feasible for them to use AI in that practical context. So just, weaving backwards and forwards, different types of technologies for different types of tasks. I work a lot here in vocational education. So, if I wanted to get my students to do a detailed research report on weather patterns that impact agriculture in Southwest Victoria, that's very specific. And, I could make those students conduct a lengthy and detailed research project on this. But frankly, these students want to be spending time out in the fields testing soil and working with livestock. And for me, the most important outcome is, can they gather and interpret that data, not how did they acquire the data? And once I use something like deep research, I'll get a report that looks like this, perhaps. And the important thing again is to be able to go through and check out these websites. A little bit of media literacy, but are these accurate? Yes. Is the information relevant? 100%. And they can do this with free tools like Perplexity. They can do it with all kinds of things. This next example is just a way of showing that level 2 for planning doesn't mean necessarily just research, and it doesn't necessarily mean limiting the range of tools that they access. So this is a media studies style example. And, maybe we're getting the students in a media studies course to produce a short documentary. So we could do really easy stuff. We could give ChatGPT some websites and get it to synthesize some film conventions. Just, really basic stuff, building up a list of meta language. But once we have that, then maybe we can start brainstorming with ChatGPT. I'm planning a short documentary on the subject of teen social media use, suggest some ideas for an opening sequence, yada, yada, yada. We know it can do all of that kind of stuff. And sometimes, getting students to brainstorm ideas is important, and sometimes it isn't. Frankly, having taught these kinds of subjects for a long time in K-12 and in higher ed, sometimes you just want to get to the point where the students are holding a camera in their hands and doing the practical work. And in those instances, maybe it's okay if I say to ChatGPT, focus on the visual elements, sketch out the first few moments of an opening sequence, show me what you've got, create some storyboard ideas. And then I take those ideas from ChatGPT and from the websites that I provided earlier, and then maybe I do a few very, very quick sketches of storyboards. So I'll pause here. Here's my amazing storyboards. There's a phone, somebody staring at a phone, somebody holding a phone at the breakfast table. And then use something like Firefly. And if I throw those in as composition references and copy paste the language from ChatGPT's prompt, and I can bounce between Firefly and Google Image Gen, and I'll speed this up so that you don't have to watch me generating endless images. But I can very, very quickly create an enormous bank of images for my storyboard. This is still just level 2. This is still just planning, because eventually the students are going to have to go out there and they're going to have to do the real work of producing a film. Okay, some of them will be acting, some of them will be directing, some of them will be holding a camera. But I'm speeding up this process of the idea development, the process of some of that initial work. And because AI is the way that it is, and you can use it so flexibly, we could generate lots of different images. And we can even, down the track, once these technologies get a bit better, turn those little still images into videos, into movie clips, stitch them together, and then we've got a much more engaging storyboard. And it's still a storyboard, it's still planning, I can use the meta language of media. I can talk about camera rotations and movements. And again, just choose my favorite pictures, chuck them all in, and end up with a little video. AI image generation is weird. Video generation is even more weird. So you've got weird non-existent languages that says undaswi at the top of that screen, dislocated thumbs, people walking backwards down the street and dissolving into one another. But it's an interesting little visual and an interesting way to think of doing a storyboard. So those are just a couple of examples of just at level 2. And I would encourage you to lean in to your own subject matter and context and start with a couple of those lower stakes, maybe early study units, early in the course, research, planning, all of those kinds of tasks, and think about where students might use AI, and then have those discussions really openly and really transparently. And finally, the AIS, the assessment scale, it's not an integrity tool. It's not going to stop anyone from cheating. I've spoken to some educators; they're amazed by this. I'm not sure how they think our lovely, colourful little chart will stop anyone from cheating, but it doesn't work like that. You can't just say to a student, "This is a level 2 task. Please stop there," and then just promises you haven't done anything wrong. Because then it will disadvantage some students over others. And some will use AI and get away with it, and some will do it in clandestine ways, and some won't use AI and will do great work and may sort of struggle to compete with some of their peers in some instances. So to keep things really clear for everyone, we say this task here, we're encouraging or we're allowing or we're exploring AI use. You can use AI if you want or not. And the way that you use AI does not have an impact on the validity of your work and doesn't have an impact on the grade if we are grading this work. So these are tough conversations, but I think they're really necessary conversations. And I'd love to open up a little bit of time for Q&A now, as I said. And I'll start the Q&A. I've just got one eye on the chat here. And I can see Stuart's just popped in there that if a student's going to cheat, they're going to cheat. Such is life. We know that this is true. We know students cheat for all kinds of reasons as well, not necessarily nefarious all the time. They might have competing pressures, carers' responsibilities, part-time jobs. There was an article recently in the New York Times that said students are cheating their way through university. It was very adversarial, very pits students and teachers against each other. And then just today, there was a counter article written by a great journalist, Kashmir Hill, in the New York Times, saying students are angry at professors for using AI to write their assessments and grade their work. And again, it was very adversarial. And I don't think we need that. I don't think we need to be putting ourselves in opposition with students, trying to catch them in the act of using AI, especially if we're using it ourselves.